The first time Owen walked into my office, I felt the air shift. It wasn't just his presence, though that was undeniable, but the way he carried himself, as if the room belonged to him, not me. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he lingered by the window, his eyes scanning the space like he was appraising it. Or appraising me. I cleared my throat, a small, professional sound meant to ground us both. "Welcome, Owen. Please have a seat." He turned, his smile slow and deliberate, as if he knew the effect it would have. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett." His voice was smooth, low, and it wrapped around me like a warm blanket I didn't ask for. He finally sat, crossing one leg over the other, his posture relaxed but somehow still commanding. I folded my hands on my desk, my usual shield of professionalism. "What brings you here today?" His gaze held mine unflinching. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life, doctor?" The question caught me off guard. Clients often came with questions, but they were usually about themselves, not me. I tilted my head, studying him. "Can you elaborate?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his intensity pulling me closer even as I resisted. "I mean, do you ever look around and wonder how you ended up here? In this house, this job, this marriage? Like you're standing outside yourself, watching a stranger." My breath hitched. How could he know? I forced a smile, the kind I used to deflect. "That's an interesting question, Owen. But I'm here to talk about you, not me." He didn't look away. Maybe they're one and the same. The session continued, but his words lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. He spoke about his life with a detached curiosity, as if it were a story he was recounting, not something he'd lived. And yet, there was something achingly familiar in his tone, in the way he talked about feeling trapped, unseen. When the hour was up, he stood, his movements fluid, almost predatory. "Thank you, doctor. I think I'll be seeing you again." "Of course," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling under the desk. As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I wasn't prepared for. That night, I lay in bed next to Richard, staring at the ceiling. His steady breathing filled the room, a sound I'd grown so used to it was almost invisible. But tonight, it grated on me. I thought about Owen's question, about living someone else's life. Had I just followed the path laid out for me, never stopping to ask if it was what I wanted? Richard stirred, his arm reaching out to pull me closer. I let him, but I didn't feel comforted. Instead, I felt a hollow ache, a longing for something I couldn't name. The next session with Owen was no easier. He was there, right on time, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He didn't waste time. "Tell me, doctor, do you believe in fate?" I hesitated, my pen hovering over my notebook. "I think we make our own choices, Owen. Fate is just a way to avoid taking responsibility for them." He smirked, as if he'd expected that answer. "What if it's not about responsibility? What if it's about connection? About finding the person who makes you feel alive again?" My stomach tightened. "Is that what you're looking for?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something else. But then he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Maybe." The weeks passed, and our sessions became a strange dance. He asked questions that felt more like accusations, and I answered them as best I could, though I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or to myself. And then, one day, he didn't ask a question. He stood up, his movements slower than usual, and walked around my desk. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek, and suddenly his lips were on mine, soft but insistent. I should have pulled away. I knew I should, but I didn't. When he finally broke the kiss, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, before turning and walking out of the room. I sat there, my hand pressed to my mouth, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do now. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a stone. Richard's soft snoring beside me only made it worse. How could he not feel it? How could he not sense the shift in the air, the way everything had tilted? But he slept on, oblivious, and I was left alone with my thoughts. Owen's kiss replayed in my mind on a loop. The way his fingers had brushed my cheek, the warmth of his lips, the intensity of his gaze when he pulled away. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a question, a challenge, a door swinging open that I wasn't sure I wanted to step through. But the thought of closing it again felt impossible. What was I supposed to do now? The next morning, I dragged myself to the office, my coffee untouched, my mind still racing. I tried to focus on my other clients, but their words felt distant, muffled, like I was hearing them through water. All I could think about was Owen. Would he come to his session today? What would he say? What would I say? When the time came, I sat at my desk, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it when he walked in. And then the door opened, and there he was. He looked calm. Too calm. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't turned my world upside down with a single, unasked-for kiss. I managed to keep my voice steady as I greeted him, but my hands were trembling. "How are you today, Owen?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. He tilted his head, studying me with that same unnerving intensity. "I'm fine," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "How are you, Eleanor?" My name on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. He'd never called me by my first name before. It felt intimate. Too intimate. I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm fine, thank you." He settled into the chair across from me, his posture relaxed, his gaze unwavering. "Are you sure about that?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. How much did he see? How much did he know? I wanted to look away, to break the connection, but I couldn't. His eyes held me captive, and I felt like he was seeing straight through me, past the therapist, past the mask. "Yes," I said finally, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. He didn't say anything, just leaned back, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, pushing me to fill it, to say something, anything, to break the tension. But I didn't, and neither did he. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You didn't stop me." My breath hitched, and I felt my cheeks flush. "What?" "Yesterday," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You didn't stop me." I opened my mouth to protest, to remind him of the boundaries he'd crossed, the rules we were both supposed to follow. But the words wouldn't come, because he was right. I hadn't stopped him, and I didn't know why. I should have, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It was inappropriate. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze sharp and probing. "But you didn't. Why?" I shook my head, my thoughts a jumbled mess. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," he said, his voice firm, almost commanding. "Tell me." I felt a surge of frustration, mingled with something else, something I didn't want to name. This isn't about me, Owen. This is about you. You're my client. I can't." "We both know that's not true," he interrupted, his tone cutting through my words like a knife. "This stopped being about me a long time ago, Eleanor. You know it as well as I do." I stared at him, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Was he right? Had this always been about more than just him? I thought back to our sessions, to the way he'd challenged me, pushed me, forced me to confront things I'd long buried. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was right. This wasn't just about him, but admitting that felt dangerous, like stepping off a ledge without knowing what was below. So I stayed silent, my hands clenched in my lap, my eyes fixed on his. He didn't push me. He just waited, his gaze steady, patient, as though he knew I'd give in eventually. And I did. "I don't know what you want from me," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I want." His eyes softened, just a little, and he leaned back in his chair again. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe you're not supposed to know, not yet." I looked at him, my heart aching with something I couldn't name. "And what happens when I do?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, his silence more powerful than any words. And then he stood up, brushing the creases from his pants, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, glancing back at me. "We'll find out," he said simply, and then he was gone. I sat there for a long time after he left, my mind racing, my heart heavy. What was I doing? What was I risking? And more importantly, why? But the questions were starting to feel less like barriers and more like possibilities. And that scared me more than anything. That evening, Richard was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I watched him from the doorway, my thoughts a tangled mess. How could he not see it? How could he not feel the distance between us? "How was your day?" he asked without looking up, his tone casual, almost perfunctory. "Fine," I said, the word automatic empty. He nodded, humming to himself as he tossed the vegetables into a pan. I wanted to say something, to tell him about the turmoil inside me, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? Later, as we sat at the table, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I picked at my food, my appetite gone, my mind still swirling. Richard glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his tone more curious than concerned. I forced a smile, though it felt tight. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the answer without question, and went back to his meal. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a pang of guilt. Was I the problem? Was this distance between us my fault? But then I thought of Owen, of the way he'd made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, and the guilt was replaced by something else, something I wasn't ready to face. After dinner, I retreated to the study, my thoughts still churning. Richard didn't follow. He never did. And for the first time, I wondered if that was what I wanted. I opened my laptop, staring at the blank screen, my fingers hovering over the keys. I didn't know what I was planning to write, but I needed to do something, to get the feelings out of my head and onto the page before they consumed me. But before I could start, my phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name on the screen.
Owen.
I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Should I answer? Should I even read it? But curiosity, or something far more dangerous, got the better of me, and I opened the message. "I can't stop thinking about you." I stared at the message, the words burning into my retina. "I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The weight of those words felt like a physical force, pressing against my chest. I could feel my pulse quicken, thrumming in my ears like a frantic drumbeat. What does he mean by that? The question looped in my mind, relentless, but deeper down, I already knew the answer. It wasn't just idle curiosity or professional intrigue. No, this was something far more dangerous, far more intoxicating. My fingers trembled as I placed the phone back on the desk, face down. I couldn't respond. I shouldn't respond. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. Owen's presence had seeped into my mind like smoke, curling around my thoughts, my doubts, my fears. That kiss, it wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a crack in the dam, and now the floodwaters were rising. The soft chime of the grandfather clock in the corner broke the silence, reminding me of the hour. Richard would be home soon. The thought of him, his steady, predictable presence, felt like a weight pressing down on me. I loved him. Of course I did. But love wasn't enough. Was it? Not when it felt so hollow. I stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and I paused. The woman staring back at me looked different. Her eyes were wide, almost wild, and her cheeks were flushed. I hardly recognized her. Is this who I've become? A woman who hides in her office, trembling over a text from her client? The sound of the front door opening snapped me back to reality. Richard. I froze, my heart pounding. Act normal. Just act normal. But what was normal anymore? I took a deep breath, smoothing my hair and straightening my blouse. By the time Richard walked into the room, I was sitting at my desk, pretending to work. "Hey," he said, his voice warm but distant. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn corduroys. "How was your day?" "Fine," I said too quickly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, tight and clipped. I forced a smile. "Busy as usual." He nodded, his hazel eyes scanning the room before settling on me. There was a pause, a moment where he could have asked more, where he could have dug deeper. But he didn't. Instead, he just smiled his easy, uncomplicated smile and said, "Dinner's almost ready. I'm making pasta." "Sounds great," I murmured, my attention already drifting back to the phone on my desk. I could feel it there, like a live wire, humming with unspoken possibilities. Richard lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on me. For a brief moment, I thought he might say something more, might ask the question I could see hovering in his eyes. But then he shrugged and turned away, his footsteps receding down the hall. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My fingers twitched toward the phone, but I forced myself to pull them back. "Don't do it. Don't respond." But the thought of Owen, his intense gaze, the way his voice seemed to wrap around me, the heat of his lips against mine, was too much to resist. I picked up the phone and typed out a reply before I could stop myself. "We need to talk." The response came almost instantly. When I hesitated, my heart racing. This was the point of no return, and I knew it. But the pull was too strong, the lure of something, someone who made me feel alive after so many years of just going through the motions. "Tomorrow." The word materialized on the screen before I even realized I'd typed it. "Tomorrow," I confirmed, the finality of it sending a shiver down my spine. The next day, I found myself sitting across from Owen in the therapy room, the air thick with unspoken tension. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You wanted to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. I swallowed hard, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. This can't happen," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Owen raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Can it?" My heart throbbed painfully in my chest. I wanted to look away, to break the spell he seemed to have cast over me, but I couldn't. "I'm your therapist," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And," he pressed, leaning forward slightly. The space between us seemed to shrink, the room closing in around us. "Do you really think that matters?" I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. "Does it matter?" The question echoed in my mind, taunting me. Here was a man who saw me, really saw me, in a way Richard never had. Here was a man who made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, alive. "We don't get to choose who we connect with," Owen said, his voice soft but insistent. "Sometimes it just happens. And when it does, you can't just ignore it." My breath hitched, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his words. He was right. I knew he was. But admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that I wouldn't fall. "What about Richard?" I whispered, the guilt twisting like a knife in my gut. Owen's expression softened, but there was no judgment in his eyes. "What about him?" he asked gently. "Are you happy, Eleanor? Really happy?" The question hit me like a thunderbolt, shattering the fragile walls I'd built around myself. Am I happy? The answer was there, waiting, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. "You deserve more than just existing," Owen continued, his voice achingly tender. "You deserve to feel alive." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "This is wrong," I said, though the conviction in my voice was gone. Owen reached across the space between us, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" Owen's fingers lingered on mine, a silent question hanging between us. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and the weight of his words pressed against my chest like a storm waiting to break. "Maybe," he'd said, "but it feels right, doesn't it?" I couldn't answer, not with words. My breath hitched as I stared at his hand, so close to mine, so impossibly close. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stand up, to leave this room and never look back. But my body, my traitorous body, was frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of him. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. "You don't have to say anything. Just let yourself feel this." Feel this? I thought wildly. I could feel everything. The heat of his skin, the way my pulse quickened, the ache in my chest that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with him. I was unraveling thread by thread, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. Owen shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. My heart leapt into my throat, and I flinched, pulling my hand away as if burned. "We can't," I started, but the words died on my lips. He was looking at me with those dark, intense eyes, and I felt like he could see straight through me, straight to the part of me that was trembling with want. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with something that made my stomach twist. "Because of your job? Because of Richard?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Both," I whispered. "Everything." Owen leaned back slightly, but his gaze never left mine. "Do you love him?" The question caught me off guard, and I faltered. Did I love Richard? I thought of his calm, steady presence, his quiet routines, the way he moved through life without ever really seeing me. I care about him," I said finally, my voice trembling. But what?" Owen pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "But sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions." I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Like we're two people sharing a life, but not really living it." Owen nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer. "And what do you want, Eleanor? What do you want?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What did I want? I wanted to feel alive. I wanted to be seen, to be wanted. But saying that out loud felt dangerous, like it would make it real. "You don't have to answer now," Owen said softly, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, almost cautious, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "But you don't have to keep pretending either." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, to quiet the storm in my mind. But it was no use. Every thought, every feeling, was tangled up in him. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering, ready to fall. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered, my voice breaking. Owen's hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin. "Maybe that's okay," he said quietly. "Maybe you don't have to know. Maybe you just have to trust yourself." I opened my eyes, and he was so close. Too close. His breath was warm against my skin, and I could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jawline, the way his lips parted slightly as he looked at me. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Can I?" I didn't let him finish. I couldn't. Something inside me snapped, and I leaned in, closing the distance between us. My lips brushed against his tentative questioning. For a moment he stilled, and I thought I'd made a mistake. But then his hands were in my hair, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, igniting something raw and primal inside me. It was nothing like the chaste peck in my office. This was desperate, hungry, like we were trying to consume each other. His mouth moved against mine with a feverish intensity, and I gasped, my hands gripping his shoulders as if I might fall if I let go. His tongue brushed against my bottom lip, and I opened for him, a soft moan escaping my throat. Every rational thought, every shred of guilt, was drowned out by the sensation of him. His hands roamed my back, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. His lips trailed down my neck, and I arched into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. "Owen," I gasped, my voice trembling. We shouldn't." He pulled back slightly, his breath coming in shallow pants. "Do you want to stop?" I hesitated, my body screaming at me to say no, to keep going, to let this happen. But my mind was a whirlwind of doubt and fear. I don't know," I whispered. Owen leaned his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "I'll respect it." But I need you to know that I'm not going to pretend I don't want this. I'm not going to pretend I don't want you. His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my resolve crumble. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel. My hands moved almost of their own accord, sliding down his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. Owen's breath hitched, and he looked at me, his eyes dark with desire. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in again, my lips brushing against his as my hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. Owen's hands covered mine, stilling them. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. I looked into his eyes, my heart pounding. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I need this. I need you." Owen searched my face for a moment, as if weighing my words. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "But we go slow. If you change your mind." "I won't," I interrupted, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. His lips curved into a small, almost relieved smile, and he leaned in, capturing my mouth in a kiss that was both tender and electric. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, letting the world outside fade away. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The days that followed were a blur of whispered confessions and stolen moments. Owen and I began meeting in places far removed from the sterile confines of my office, coffee shops tucked into quiet corners, parks where the rustling leaves masked our hushed conversations. Each encounter was charged with an intensity that left me breathless, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Richard, ever the steady presence in my life, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing within me. He moved through his routines with the same calm detachment, his hazel eyes never quite meeting mine in a way that stirred any deeper emotions. "How was your day?" he would ask over dinner, his voice warm but distant. "Fine," I'd reply, the word tasting bitter on my tongue.
"Fine."
As if my world hadn't been turned upside down. As if I wasn't betraying him with every thought of Owen. But was it really a betrayal? The question nagged at me, a relentless itch I couldn't scratch. Richard and I had settled into a comfortable pattern, but comfort had long since given way to something far more hollow. I'd buried my longing beneath layers of routine, convincing myself that this was enough. But Owen had unearthed it all, forcing me to confront the ache I'd tried so hard to ignore. One evening, after Richard had retreated to his study, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked different somehow, her cheeks flushed, her eyes alive with a fire I hadn't seen in years. It terrified me.
It exhilarated me.
My phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced down to see Owen's name lighting up the screen. My heart leapt, a traitorous rush of anticipation flooding my veins. "Did you feel it too?" The message read, simple yet loaded with meaning. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could I explain what I felt? How could I put into words the way his presence had become a lifeline, pulling me from the depths of my own complacency? "Yes," I typed back after a moment, the words sending a shiver down my spine. I felt it. The following afternoon, I found myself standing outside Owen's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. He opened the door before I could even knock, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. His dark eyes met mine, and the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice low and tinged with vulnerability. "Neither was I admitted, stepping inside. The apartment was warm, filled with the faint scent of his cologne. It wrapped around me like a familiar embrace, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. Owen closed the door behind us, his gaze never leaving mine. "Eleanor," he began, but I cut him off, stepping closer until there was barely any space between us. "I don't want to talk," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not right now." His eyes softened, and he reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. What did I want? The answer was there, simmering just beneath the surface, but voicing it felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. I want to forget. I finally said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Just for a little while, I want to forget everything but you. Owen's expression shifted, a mix of concern and something deeper, something that mirrored the ache in my own chest. Eleanor, you don't have to run from this, he said softly. You don't have to pretend you're okay when you're not. I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I'm not running.
I'm chosen.
For the first time in so long, I'm choosing what I want. His hand moved to my waist, pulling me closer until I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. And what is it you want? He murmured, his breath brushing against my ear. I closed my eyes, letting the words tumble out in a rush. I want you. I want this. I want to feel like I'm more than just existing. Owen didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. His arms wrapped around me, holding me as if he thought I might disappear if he let go. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of guilt pressing down on me.